A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Star Wars, Scourge. The Tale of Jedi Archivist Mander Zuma. By Jeff Grubb, 2012. A novelization of the Star Wars role-playing game Tempest, Feud, and set in 19 ABY. This is the tale of a Jedi scholar searching for justice. Created and read by the Archivist Publishing.
Prologue. Death of a Jedi.
The Pantoran Jedi Toro Irana was angry. He had been waiting on this hellhole planet for weeks now, and as his former master, Mander Zuma, was all too fond of telling him, Toro's patience was never his most admirable trait. Meetings had been set up, canceled, rescheduled, moved to new locations, and canceled once again. And now, on top of everything else, his contact was keeping him waiting in this rooftop restaurant, 40 stories up and overlooking a planetary graveyard. By this time, Toro's patience had worn thin. Toro could feel his blue skin itch and his lips swell. He reached for the bottle of scent wine to pour himself another round. Even at the best of times, a late arrival or a delay from decision and action would frustrate him. Now, on the world of Makm-T, it drove Toro to the point of distraction. The air of this planet reeked of smelter dust and desiccated meat. The world itself was dominated by the Tract, a huge iron-shod necropolis that from space resembled an ice cap. The restaurant windows commanded a sweeping view of the crypts and mausoleums of the Tract, which to Toro resembled nothing less than rows of odd-shaped pegged teeth rising from skeletal jaws. Even a setting sun, blue-green through the swirling dust, could do nothing to improve the view. And as for the planet's inhabitants, Toro suppressed a shudder and looked over at the swokes milling around their dining troughs. His first opinion upon making planetfall was that they were huge lumps of malformed flesh, and increased familiarity did nothing to change that opinion. They looked more melted than crafted by any environment, their pale, sagging flesh spilling from their horned heads directly to their bodies, with no visible sign of a neck, except the swokes spent less time maintaining them, and their incisors canted outward at all angles. Their faces were otherwise flat, with a random number of nostril holes and bland white eyes set into shallow black sockets. It would give them a comical look were the species not, to the last member, bullies and thugs. In short, they were the perfect species for this back-rocket planet, the perfect caretakers of this tombstone world. And right now, every last one of them was getting on his nerves. The restaurant for this meeting catered primarily to the lumpy natives, and the tables were dominated by long troughs into which the host poured a noxious concoction of spice-leavened boiled meats mixed with what looked like shedshinga scales and live sand bugs. There were smaller, more traditional tables around the perimeter of the room, near the windows, but he and a couple of Nikto traders, 2 booths over, were the only customers who used them, and the only customers who didn't look half melted. The temperature was set comfortable for the swokes, which was too cold by half for Toro, and the sound of the creatures eating would frighten the old emperor himself. Toro downed the scent wine, since its aroma killed most of the rest of the smells in the room. He waved for the waiter, who shambled toward him.
More of these beetle things,
said Toro, pointing to the pile of now empty black shells.
and some of the local swill as well.
Tomato paying,
burbled the waiter, and then shifted from swoken to a slurred, sloppy basic.
Pay now, Blueskin.
I'm waiting for someone,
said Toro.
Run me a tab.
The swokes burbled something else in swoken, then provided a rough translation.
Going off my shift, Blueskin. Pay now.
Toro swung in his iron chair and let his robe fall open, revealing the gleam of his lightsaber. His hand drifted down to touch it, but not to grasp it.
I said,
he growled,
that you should run me a tab. My contact will cover it.
The swokes frowned, or at least tried to frown through its rolls of ash-gray fat, but it backed off, and a short time later, another plate of broiled beetles and a two-handled mug of the local alcohol, potent but, like everything else in this place, imbued with a mild flavor of dust and spice. Still, if he rationed out the remaining purplish scent wine, it could mask most of the stench. Toro examined the bottle. A Rhodian brought it, along with his patron's apologies, unavoidably delayed and all that garbage. Toro was sure that it was only a gambit to establish power and control in this situation, but knowing that made the young Jedi even more irritated. Still, the wine was a rose in the junkyard, a bright floral smell among the rest of this iron-shod planet. Had to have come from off-world, he realized. Another symbol of power and control from his contact. Across the room, two swokes started howling at each other in high-pitched screeches.
Banch and plank on him. Cacao can get.
Religious argument, guessed Toro, since most of the arguments on this planet were about religion and death. Toro wondered if it would come to blows. Not that it mattered. Swokes could regenerate all but the most grievous of damage. It was one reason members of the species were prized as mercenaries, guards, and leg breakers. Toro could feel his temples throb at the guttural shrieks across the room. Enough. Finish the drink, and he would be done. His contact would have to learn that he was not the only one with power in this relationship. Something heavy and soft slammed into Toro from behind, throwing him forward across the table. The last of the scent wine spilled from its glass, and the bottle toppled and rolled out of his grasp, falling to the floor on the far side of the table with a brittle thump, along with the double-handled swill mug. Toro turned in his chair to find that his assailant was another swokes, its body bedecked in jewelry set over the vital spots. This one was higher caste, but still had the soggy, blank-faced look of the rest of its species. The swokes spat out something that could have been an apology, but was more likely a warning.
Badoro Alderwood Plankin.
Toro stood up, and for a moment the room swayed beneath his feet.
Watch where you're going,
the Jedi snarled. The bejeweled alien snapped something sharp.
Tomato get.
Definitely an insult from the way the other swokes with it reacted. It drew itself up to its full height, about a head taller than Toro. The two stared at each other for a long moment. Then the swokes raised a four-fingered hand to push Toro out of the way. Drinking or not, angry or not, Toro's reflexes snapped into a set response. Half a step backward to put distance between them, his hand effortlessly unsheathing the lightsaber and bringing it up in a smooth, practiced move, thumbing the switch, and deploying the blade in a single action. The Swokes had only a second to regret its action before Toro brought the blade up and cut through the creature's forearm. The Swokes shuddered, but did not cry out, instead looking at the cauterized stump of its arm with puzzlement.
Right,
Thought Toro.
the species not only regenerates, but it also lacks local pain centers. Another reason they make good leg breakers.
The injured Swokes let out a howl, more from indignation than pain. Everyone turned in their seats to see the blue-skinned Pantoran wielding a lightsaber and his injured opponent. As one, the aliens rose from their meals, some grabbing iron dining forks as they did so, others hefting the heavy iron stools. They converged on the pair. The injured Swokes pushed forward, its good arm raised like a warty club. Toro danced backward, up over the iron chair, and onto the table itself, bringing the lightsaber around in a smooth, level arc. The Swokes' head separated at the approximate intersection of its neck and body, spilling backward into the surging mob.
Regenerate that,
Toro said. The death of the high caste alien gave half the group pause, while it infuriated the other half. Toro noted that the two Niktos from the other table were already heading for the door, along with the waiter. But that was all he had time to notice before the mob was on top of him. Toro spun with the lightsaber, cutting through flesh and iron with equal ease. One of the attackers had thought enough to duck beneath the sweeping blade and grabbed Toro's sword arm in a soft but unrelenting embrace. Toro tossed the lightsaber to his left hand and brought up a booted foot into the alien's face. The entire face gave in like soft putty, which did not seem to trouble the creature in the slightest, but the grasp on Toro's arm lessened. The Jedi drew his blade through the attacker's arm, and the detached limb loosened its grip fully now, vanishing into the tumult. Something heavy and dark flew toward him, and Toro reached up and split an iron-shod stool in two with his blade, the pieces caromming off the window supports behind him. Two more Swokes grabbed at Toro's feet on the table, but he leapt up, spinning and dragging his blade across the table's surface, separating hands from arms as he did so. Now makeshift missiles showered Toro. Stools, eating utensils, two-handled goblets, and bits of food. The Jedi wove his blade through the air, cutting down the more dangerous, dodging the merely disgusting. The glass behind him spidered from the heavier missiles but did not break. Assailants would try to get close, but he would spin and leave these missing a few appendages for their trouble. Where they wore embedded jewels, signs of status among their people, the Jedi treated them as targets, carving them from too soft flesh. Toro realized that he was cursing now, cursing at this planet and its people and his contact and the uncaring universe that would put him in this place at this particular time. His chin was wet, and when he wiped his sleeve against it, it came away with a bubbling bloody froth on it. Had he been injured? Had one of these melted, horrible creatures gotten lucky against him? He snarled, and his vision seemed coated in blood as well. They would all pay for attacking him. There was movement behind him, and Toro spun and lashed out without thinking. The table, already weakened from his assaults, collapsed, pitching him forward. Toro leapt, slashing as he did, and only then realizing that he had mistaken his opponent. His foe was only his reflection in the window, caught by the dying sun. But then it was too late, and he was through the window itself, the fury of his blade sharding it into 1,000 daggers from the blow. He twisted to catch the ledge, but he had leapt too far, and he spun out into open, dust-strewn air, 40 stories above the necropolis. The entire way down, all Toro could feel was the anger.
Chapter 1. A Mystery on Makm-T.
Mander Zuma pursed his lips as he moved through the back alleys of Makm-T. He was far from the tract, far from the necropolis that dominated this world, far from the site of Toro Irana's death, and far from satisfied with what he had discovered so far about the death of his former apprentice. Word had reached Yavin 4 and the new Jedi Order in the form of a complaint from the Congress of Caliphs that ruled Makm-T of a blue-skinned Jedi who had killed a Caliph's nephew. Apologies were made through the New Republic's diplomatic channels, but Mander was pulled from his regular duties in the archives and dispatched to find out what had really happened. His assignment made perfect sense to Mander. He had taught Toro in the ways of the Force, and had monitored the young Jedi's own reports back to the Order. His own skill set dovetailed nicely with Toro's assigned mission, yet the older Jedi was still reluctant to leave behind the archives, to leave Yavin 4 after years of diligent and productive research. What Mander found on this planet surprised him. Not that Toro had gotten into a fight. The young man had been headstrong and easily riled even when he had been his apprentice, and the Swokes were by all reports a prickly species to deal with. But the idea that Toro had gotten into an argument so easily, or that he had made such a fatal mistake in combat, troubled Mander deeply as he made the long trip from Yavin to Makm-T. As he stepped off the shuttle and breathed the dusty air of this world, the questions swirled within him. What had gone wrong? Had it been his training that had been at fault? Had Mander prepared him insufficiently? Or were there other factors at work? As a student, Toro had been a superb warrior, limber and smooth, a blue-fleshed blur in combat. More important, he bonded with his lightsaber, treating the blade as an extension of his self. Even in training, Mander was impressed with the young Pantoran's skill and confidence. Mander himself had none of that easiness in combat. The Force was strong in the older Jedi, but it was directed elsewhere. He could feel the energy moving through him, but his own lightsaber often felt like an alien thing, a lump in his hand. He had come to the Force late in life, as did many in the later years of the Empire, and it showed. Toro was better with a lightsaber, and Mander was sure that he would have become a fine Jedi Knight. A better Jedi Knight than he. But now, Toro was dead, and Mander was not sure why. Mander's first stop was to claim the body and examine it, a rented medical droid at his side, burbling commentary. The dried flecks of blood on his apprentice's lips and the broken bones along one side of his body spoke of a sudden, violent end. But there was also a darkening of the young man's veins and arteries, violet against the sea blue of his flesh, that had not been present in life, and pointed to an external agent at work. Further, purple crystals budded at the corners of Toro's eyes. Mander was not sure if this was natural to the Pantorans in death, but he assumed it was not, and took a sample of the material. It had a pungent aroma, more cloying than the acrid dust of Makm-T's air. There were similar crystals in the dead Jedi's darkened veins, now stilled of pulsing life. Something had been injected or ingested, he decided. Toro was under the influence of something else before the fight, Mander thought. And, possibly, the two events were tied. The older Jedi double-checked his evaluation before consigning Toro's body to the funeral pyre. The Swokes, regardless of their official indignation, were extremely helpful with funeral arrangements. It was a point of pride for them. Mander Zuma visited the scene of Toro's death, the restaurant. It had been closed for a period of mourning for the Caliph's nephew, but already the smashed furniture had been stacked to one side for recycling, and a new sheet of plate glass installed, replacing the one shattered by Toro's exit. The waitstaff was initially unhelpful, but Mander's modest knowledge of Swoken, the native language, combined with a bit of the force in the voice, helped smooth out the questions. By the end of the interview, the staff was positively chatty about the incident. Yes, the blue-skinned Jedi had been there. He was waiting for someone, he had said. He had been drinking. A lot. Local stuff, but a Rodian came in with another bottle, a gift. The Jedi had insulted the staff, insulted the other diners. He had gotten into an argument with Chokachok, the Caliph's nephew. The Jedi pulled his lightsaber and killed Chokachok, killed 5 more regulars as well, and had left a dozen regenerating, screaming in that weird liquid-sounding off-worlder basic. Not a proper language at all. Foaming at the mouth. Then he had smashed his way through the window. The wait staff thought he was trying to escape, but had forgotten he was 40 floors up. The joke was on him. No one had found the Jedi's energy blade, or at least reported that they had found it. Yes, they had the bottle the Rodian brought somewhere around. They were still cleaning up the mess. The Swokes provided the bottle, and Mander calibrated his medical data pad. A few simple tests on the dregs in the bottle confirmed his hunch. There was something unusual in the scent wine. Potent, unknown, and similar in composition to the crystalline tears at the corners of the corpse's eyes. Distilled out, it had the same cloying smell. The wine's bouquet covered the smell. Poison, then. The Rodian brought the wine. Was the poison what clouded his judgment at the end? The possibility left Mander concerned. Why was Toro unwary enough to drink the wine in the first place? A Jedi in the field had to be aware of his surroundings and potential attacks. Had he trusted the Rodian, or whoever the Rodian represented? And what, if anything, did this have to do with his assigned task to acquire the navigation coordinates for the Indrexu spiral? Was someone trying to stop the New Republic from gaining those codes? Or had Toro stumbled onto something else? Indeed, scanning the last communications from Toro to the new Jedi Order had been troubling as well. They had been brief, even terse. He had made initial contacts. He had begun negotiations. He was pleased with the progress, nothing to indicate that there was a problem. Even so, there was a brusqueness in his communiques that now gave Mander pause. Details were missing. Now the trail led to this warehouse, made of ancient wood, reinforced with the cold iron that was so much a part of Swokes architecture. There were few Rhodians on Makm-T, and it was relatively easy to track Toro's deadly wine steward back here. A Rhodian family cartel ran a small trade out of these warehouses, trafficking in ornate funeral plaques and reliquaries and other off-world items. The darkness of the alley cloaked him more effectively than any mind trick, but the lock was old and stubborn, and at last Mander used the force to snap the hasp. So much for getting in and getting out without leaving any trace, he thought. Carefully, he slid the door open, but was met only with a hollow echo of the sliding metal. He slipped inside, leaving enough of a gap that he could leave quickly if things went bad. Mander moved quietly at first, but it was quickly clear that no one seemed to be present. Moonlight from the frosted skylights overhead shone on a bare floor. Mander reached into a vest pocket and pulled out a set of Magna specs, 2 pinkish lenses set in hexagonal frames. He unfolded the lenses and placed them on the bridge of his nose. Magnets in the frame held them there, pinching his flesh slightly. When he tapped the side of the lenses, they issued a soft, pale red glow, heightening the available light in the dim warehouse. Large wooden racks stood in neat, ordered rows from floor to ceiling along the length of the structure. Empty cargo containers were lined along one wall, and a trio of manual load lifters, great Walker engines with huge spatulate hands, along the other. These Rhodians were too poor or too cheap for droid-operated versions. The shelves were heavily laden with blank epitaph plates and bolts of funeral shrouds, all covered in a thin coating of dust. Scraps and more dust were heaped in the corners as well. Whatever business was being done out of this warehouse had precious little to do with mortuary arrangements. In the center of the room was a pile of broken crates, damaged and abandoned in a rush to clear out. Clear spots showed where other crates once stood, and the dust was disturbed by the broad feet of the load lifters. Somewhere far off, in some connecting warehouse, there was a soft thunder of people moving crates, but this place was devoid of workers. Mander frowned. Whoever poisoned Toro expected someone to come after them, and had probably decided to put a few planets between them and their pursuers. No doubt, the warehouse was under an assumed name and behind 3 shell companies. Tracking them down would not be easy. Mander poked through the trash with his toe. Funeral robes and tapestries, metal plates with Swokes memorials, about 3 or 4 containers worth that had been breached and abandoned. And there, glittering in the moonlight, something dark and crystalline. The Jedi knelt down next to the pile and examined the crystals. They were purplish, dark almost to the point of being black. He sniffed it, and it gave off a rich, pungent aroma. Spice, but unlike any he had seen before. He pulled out a plastic clear envelope and scooped a handful of crystals into it. That was when he knew he was not alone. It could have been a shadow against the moonlight or a footstep landing too heavily, but at once he knew that someone else was in the warehouse with him. He rose slowly from his examination, trying to move naturally, his hand fumbling with the strap of the lightsaber. Still, he engaged it, and brought the ignited blade up, glowing green, before the first blaster bolt erupted. Mander parried the energy discharge, trying to send it back to his attacker, but succeeding only in deflecting it among the racks of epitaph markers. Inwardly, he cursed at his lack of skill. Another shot unleashed, again from near the warehouse's entrance, and again Mander turned the energy pulse aside, but only just, and it scorched the wall behind him. Mander reminded himself that he was in a wooden building containing flammable funeral shrouds. Too many such stray shots would be a bad thing.
I can do this all day.
He lied to the darkness.
Why don't you come out and we can talk?
There was a shadow against the doorway, and for a moment Mander was sure that his assailant would try to flee. Instead, a lone figure walked into a rectangular square of moonlight. Smoke swirled from the barrel of her DL-22 heavy blaster. She was almost Mander's height, and even in the pale radiance Mander could see that her flesh was a rich blue, marked with yellow swirls on each cheek. Long hair, a deeper blue in shade, almost to the color of night, was worn short in the front, woven in a thick braid down the back. A Pantoran, then, like Toro. Her lips were a thin, grim line, and her eyes flashed with anger.
Why are you shooting at me?
Said Mander calmly, as if being shot at in a warehouse were a common occurrence for him.
I'm here for justice,
she said, and the barrel came up. Despite himself, Mander brought up his lightsaber in defense, but she did not fire.
Justice is good,
said Mander, trying to keep his voice casual.
I'm seeking justice as well. Perhaps you'd like to help me find some.
He paused and added,
You know, I once trained a Pantoran in the ways of the Force.
This time she did shoot, and Mander almost toppled back onto the pile of trash, bringing his blade up. Almost too late, and as it was, he deflected the bolt upward instead of back. There was the distant crash of a shattered skylight.
You're the one responsible for Toro's death, then,
said the Pantoran, her words as sharp as a vibroblade's edge.
Relative?
Asked Mander, willing himself to be ready for another shot. It did not come.
Sister.
Mander forced himself to relax, or at least give the impression of relaxing. He deactivated his lightsaber, even though he wasn't sure he could reignite it fast enough should she choose to fire.
You're Rian Irana, then,
he said.
Toro spoke to me of you.
The blaster jerked toward him for a moment, but the Pantoran did not fire. Mander added quickly,
I was not here when Toro died. I was back at the Academy on Yavin 4. I came here when we heard the news, to find out what happened, and to finish Toro's assignment.
The blaster wavered just a bit, but at last she pointed it away from the Jedi. Even in the moonlight, he could see a wetness glistening at the corner of her eyes.
It's your fault,
she managed at last, her voice throaty with grief. Mander waited, giving her time to gather her thoughts. When she spoke again, the iron had returned to her words.
Toro was a dreamer, and you took him to become a Jedi, and now he's dead. You are responsible.
Mander held his palms out and said simply,
Yes.
Rian was startled at the admission. She had apparently expected the Jedi to say many things, but not this. Mander looked hard at the young Pantoran. He could see the resemblance to Toro in her face. He continued,
Yes, I am responsible. Every man's journey is his own, but I did train your brother, and he was here on Makm-T on Jedi business. So, yes, I put him in harm's way, and I failed to prepare him for what he faced here. That is why I am here. I want to find out who poisoned your brother, to see justice brought against them.
For the first time, the Pantoran seemed confused.
Poison,
she managed.
I believe so,
said Mander.
I found something strange in his blood. And now there is this.
He held up the clear envelope with the crystals.
I found it here in the warehouse.
The Pantoran kept her blaster aimed at the Jedi, but reached out with the other hand. Mander held the envelope out to her and she took it, taking a few steps back immediately in case this was a trick. Reen stared at the purplish crystals, then shook her head. She holstered her blaster, and Mander returned his now inert lightsaber to his belt.
I think it is the poison that was used,
said Mander.
A Rodian administered it with some wine he brought to your brother in the restaurant. That was why Toro was unable to defend himself at his full abilities. Why he made such a mistake in combat and plunged out the window.
Another noise in the darkness around them. Mander's head came up. It was not from outside the warehouse this time. Inside. Someone familiar with the area who knew where to step.
Hold on,
he said.
Others are here.
Reen began to say,
Don't worry. That's just...
But her words were cut off as Mander grabbed her and pulled her down. Blaster bolts erupted from 3 sides, firing into the pile of abandoned crates. Reen had her own blaster out in a flash, and for a wild moment, Mander was afraid she was going to use it on him. But instead, she returned fire against the assault, using the discarded shipping containers as cover. Mander rose to a crouch, his lightsaber ignited and at the ready. The shots were heavy, but not well placed, and he managed to bounce a few of them back. There was a shout of pain, and a string of curses in Swoken. Mander thought he must have gotten one of them.
I'd say a dozen,
shouted Reen.
Some of them up on the racks. Swokes. Some Rodians too.
Must be the Rodians that used the warehouse,
responded Mander.
I know the clan,
said Reen, bringing down a pair.
Bomu family. I recognize the facial tattoos. We're pinned down.
Hang on,
said Mander.
I'm going to level the playing field.
Reen may have said something, but Mander didn't pay attention. Instead, he leapt forward, somersaulting toward one of the racks the Rodians were using as a perch. Blaster bolts fell around him, but he didn't use his blade to block. Rather, he pulled it effortlessly through the rack's iron supports, slicing the metal easily. The entire set of racks shuddered, and then began to collapse in on itself. The shriek of the metal matched by the surprised shouts of the ambushers. Reen was at his side.
What did you do?
I made a new pile of trash to hide behind,
said Mander, as one of the surviving swokes rose from the debris, a thick-barreled blaster in his hand. One swipe with the blade cut the weapon in two, and then the swokes fell backward as Reen discharged a bolt squarely into the attacker's face. There was a short pause in the battle, and then the blaster fire started again, heavier than before. Looking back, Mander saw that their previous hiding place was on fire, and the flames were already spreading through the bolts of funeral cloth and to the room's supports. The Rodians had climbed down to the ground, trying to surround the pair. They were now clear in the firelight.
They're trying to burn us out. Can you make it to the door?
Asked Mander, but Reen just shook her head and brought down a Rodian from across the room. Mander looked across the open floor between him and the entrance. Alone, on his best day, he might be able to make it. Carrying the Pantoran, he doubted he could get halfway before the crossfire caught him. He was about to chance it anyway when something extremely large shifted in the background. It was one of the manual load lifters, wading into a squad of swokes. The huge flat feet smashed one, while the others broke and ran as it spun and slammed into another set of racks, toppling them against their neighbors in a chain of collapsing shelves. The Rhodians and swokes started pulling back, firing behind them to deter pursuit. Perched in the control pit of the lifter, limbed by sparking control screens, was a Bothan, long-faced and furry. Reen put a hand on Mander's shoulder.
Don't worry. He's with me.
The Bothan was having trouble handling the load lifter, and as he tried to get the walker under control, it grazed one of the already burning roof supports. The support groaned menacingly, and parts of the roof and skylight started to cascade down around them.
About time you showed up.
Bellowed Reen at the pilot of the stumbling walker.
And now get us out of here before this place comes down around us.
The Bothan got the load lifter under something like control and brought one of the large pallet hands level to the floor. Reen grabbed on, and Mander, deactivating his lightsaber, leapt ahead of her and turned to help her up. Then the pair gripped the sides of the lifter as the Bothan maneuvered it towards the doors through a tunnel of the now flaming warehouse. The large door was still almost completely shut, but at the last moment, the Bothan spun the lifter around and slammed through it backward, smashing the door off its hinges. Then they were outside, tromping through the alleys. The load lifter got clear of the worst of the fire and set the pair down. The Bothan himself slid down from the side of the now smoking control pit. Whatever the Bothan had done to get it working had set its internal electronics on fire.
I thought you Jedi were never supposed to be surprised,
said Reen.
I was distracted.
Said Mander, trying to keep the irritation within himself out of his voice. She was right. Despite her presence, he should have noticed their assailants creeping into their positions. In the distance, there were shouts and klaxons. The local authorities were responding to the fire, and the flames were clear along the roofline now.
We need to be elsewhere,
said Reen.
Pity we didn't get one of the Rhodians alive.
We found the poison that they used on your brother,
said Mander.
And we know that they're willing to kill to cover their tracks. For the moment, that's enough.
Dejaro of the Bomu clan made his way through the Swokes Bazaar, past the hucksters selling memorial mementos, and purified ointments and funeral wreaths, past the stalls of seers and spiritualists who, for a small fee, would contact the spirits of the recently interred and, for a slightly larger fee, confirm that they were resting comfortably and satisfied with their funeral arrangements. Dejaro squeezed his way among the lumbering forms of the Makm-T inhabitants, his own Rhodian frame unlikely to win any shoving match. He kept one hand inside his jacket, tightly gripping his heavy prize, fearful that something else would go wrong. The word had come down that afternoon. Coax, the one-eyed Clatuinian, had arrived on the planet, bearing with her both the goodwill of her master, the Spice Lord, and the Lordship's demands that the assigned task had been completed. Dejaro of the Bomu clan carried both good news and bad along with his package, and it was a good question which of the three was the heaviest weight. At the 4th Street, at the alchemical shop, he turned right and made for a singularly empty shop that displayed funeral wrappings, but had never seemed to succeed in selling any of them. The swokes behind the counter, scarred from many regenerations, just nodded to him as he passed through. Dejaro had been here before. The Rhodian climbed the iron spiral staircase to a windowless upper storage room. The room was lit by a single bulb, hanging from a noose-like cord. Coax was waiting for him, surrounded by racks of long-sleeved robes, used to dress the dead before interment or cremation. To Dejaro, it felt like they were surrounded by silent witnesses to hear his report. There was a low table between the two of them. The Clatuinian herself was lean and muscular, thinner than most of her species. She was dressed in dark red spacer's slacks and a vest, and kept a set of ceremonial throwing knives on her belt alongside her blaster. Dejaro knew the Clatuinians were mostly traditionalists, favoring the old weapons and ways. Coax apparently kept the affectations of the past alongside the more effective present. The Clatuinian's face was thin as well, but what took Dejaro aback was the crater where one eye had once been. Some would have worn a patch or had a plate bolted to their skull to hide the deformity, but Coax set a glowing red gem deep into her empty socket. The Rhodian wondered if the gem allowed the Spice Lord's agent to see into alien frequencies or tell if someone was lying. The idea chilled Dejaro to the bone.
Wajo Kosoro?
Asked the Clatuinian in fluid Huttus.
Have you brought it?
Dejaro nodded and pulled the prize from beneath his jacket. It was a thin cylinder fitted with a worn, comfortable grip along one side. It was heavier than Dejaro had thought it would be, particularly since he had seen it used with fluid, almost effortless grace. Heavy enough to hold the soul of a man, he had thought at the time. He placed the lightsaber on the table between them. Coax looked down at the device with her good eye, but did not reach out for it. The red gem set deep into her skull kept a bead on Dejaro, who waited to be dismissed or questioned.
Were there any problems?
Asked the Clatuinian.
We found it on the street,
said Dejaro, his voice sounding a little strained in the dusty, dead air.
Not too far from the body.
Did anyone see you take it?
She was still examining the deactivated blade before her.
I don't think.
And Coax looked up at him, her gemstone eye blazing for a moment.
No one saw it. It went better than we had planned. I had the wine delivered, and we were prepared to move in when he started a fight by himself. Once he went out the window, we were afraid we had lost him, that he had used some sort of Jedi trick to escape us, that he could fly away. But when we got to the bottom of the building, and there he was, dead, and the item was right beside him, just as you see it now.
Coax grunted an affirmation, then said,
We?
The other members in good standing of the Bomu clan,
said Dejaro.
trusted family all. We would have taken the body itself, but the local law was already coming down on us. As it was, I grabbed the lightsaber and kept it until I heard from you. Kept it safe, like you ordered.
Did you turn it on?
Asked Coax almost casually.
No.
Dejaro assured her.
I don't know if it still works or not. I just followed your orders. Drug the Jedi, take his lightsaber, bring it to you. Nothing about figuring out if it worked.
Coax gave a throaty chuckle and reached out to the lightsaber, grasping its short hilt and activating the blade. It sprang like a genie from the bottle, a bolt of brilliant blue-white, accompanied by a flash of radiant thunder. The empty robes that hung around them threw back deep shadows, doubling their number. Coax moved the blade back and forth. And it looked to Dejaro as if the blade fought her, like it had its own inertia, its own spirit, resisting her control, fighting her grip. Coax seemed to feel it as well, and frowned, then thumbed off the blade. At once, the upper storage room was plunged back into a dim light, which to the Rhodian seemed even darker than before.
Good,
said Coax, and reached for her belt. Despite himself, Dejaro's hand twitched toward his own weapons belt, but the Klaatuinian instead brought out a vial tucked between her belt and her dun-colored flesh. Coax smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. She had made Dejaro flinch, and understood in an instant how much the Rhodian trusted her, how much he feared her. Coax set the vial on the table. Even in the dim light, Dejaro could see that it was tightly packed with purplish crystals, deeper in hue than any he had seen before.
Pure,
said Coax.
None of that diluted garbage that reaches the street. Cut it, share, use it, I don't care. We're done.
Dejaro looked at the vial, then up at the Klaatuinian, then nodded, reached out, and snagged the vial. He tucked it into an inner pocket and said,
There's something else.
Coax's eyebrow, the one above the gem-set socket, jerked upward slightly.
Something else?
It took you a while to contact us,
said Dejaro.
While we were waiting, there was another.
Another?
Coax repeated, her voice careful, trying to draw the story out.
Another Jedi,
said the Rhodian.
Came to the restaurant, talked to the staff, tracked us back to the warehouse.
Coax held her hands out, palms outward.
Didn't you think to burn out the warehouse and move your supplies just to prevent that possibility?
We were in the process. That is, we intended to. But we didn't think he would get here before you,
managed Dejaro. Coax frowned and looked at the empty table once more.
Tell me what happened.
We ambushed him,
said Dejaro quietly.
Ambushed the Jedi.
Did you kill him?
Said Coax, and her intent was clear in the tone of her question. One dead Jedi on Makm-T was a casualty. 2 would attract more attention than the Spice Lord would want.
We lost a lot of people. The Jedi, he had backup, and he...
Dejaro froze when Coax transfixed him with the ruby eye.
Did you kill him?
She repeated.
No,
said Dejaro, looking away.
There was a firefight. The warehouse caught fire in the battle.
Too little, too late,
said Coax.
You should have torched the place the night the first Jedi died.
Dejaro nodded.
We didn't want to lose the stock. We had a lot of funeral supplies there.
Then Coax did something that Dejaro did not expect. She laughed. It was a full-throated, hearty, honest laugh. The laugh of someone confronted by the basic stupidity of the galaxy.
You kill a Jedi, then are surprised to find another one comes looking for him. You let this new Jedi uncover your operation, resulting in a firefight and setting the warehouse ablaze, and you're worried about the stock?
Dejaro himself managed a sickly chuckle and said,
We're tapped out now, except for...
He tapped the vial in his pocket with his palm.
I see,
said Coax, pulling her features back into a stern repose.
So you need...
More of the hard spice. More Tempest,
said Dejaro.
We can make it up to you. Just a little advance. Enough to keep the regulars stocked up. We did what you asked for. We didn't expect the Jedi to bring backup.
I don't think the Spice Lord will be happy about this development. Do you think that's the case?
Asked Coax.
If you want, I can talk to the Spice Lord,
said Dejaro.
Explain things.
The Spice Lord has more important matters to deal with than talking to street-level dealers,
said Coax.
That is why the Spice Lord has me.
She skewered him with her good eye, and a silence grew between the two.
So?
Dejaro's throat was dry now.
Do you think you could do something about this?
Yes, I think I could,
she said.
I think I could warn the Spice Lord that there is another Jedi, one with allies. I could also find out who these allies are and tell you. Is that what you would want?
Dejaro nodded.
The Jedi killed my clan brothers and clan sisters,
he said.
We need vengeance on their behalf.
Consider it done,
said Coax.
You have my word. The Bomu clan will get its vengeance against this Jedi, but I will warn you, if the Jedi killed so many of your clan just at the outset, there will be more lives lost before you get your vengeance.
Dejaro nodded enthusiastically.
Yes, we know. It is the price you pay for vengeance.
The Rhodian turned to leave the Klatooinian with her prize.
One last thing,
said Coax, and Dejaro froze in his tracks, turning slightly.
I will have to tell the Spice Lord that we have this problem because the Bomu clan neglected to cover its tracks sufficiently,
said Coax.
And I will have to report that I have taken appropriate action.
The Klatooinian's hand drifted to her weapons belt. Dejaro pulled his blaster, and if Coax had been going for her own, he would have beaten her to the draw. Instead, the Klatooinian pulled one of her throwing blades, and in a graceful, almost casual flick of the wrist, planted it deeply in the Rhodian's neck from 5 paces away. Dejaro went down, gurgling. Coax liked to think that last noise was an attempt at an apology. The Spice Lord's agent knelt over the dead Rhodian and pulled the small vial, the last pure sample of Tempest on Makm-T, from Dejaro's inside pocket. Then she pulled one of the death robes from its hooks and draped it solemnly over the body.
Another victim of this new Jedi,
said Coax.
But I am good to my word, and will gladly throw as many of your clan in his way as I need to.
She let out a deep sigh.
But first,
continued the one-eyed Klatooinian,
I will have to send a message to the Spice Lord, presenting the bad news. And let me tell you, Rhodian, that you got off easy in that you had to deal with me instead of the one I serve.
Chapter 2. Negotiations.
They sat quietly at the table. Mander Zuma, Reen Irana, and the Bothan. The 3 had headed away from the sirens and after half an hour they found themselves at a Swokes tap cafe that specialized in outlander cuisine, or at least the Swokes' best guess of it. The establishment was missing the traditional trench down the center of the room, but the tables were still massive and, Mander noted, bolted to the floor. They sat across from one another, the clear envelope with the crystals between them. Reen Irana stared at it like it was a live snake, fascinated and horrified. Her Bothan companion, who had not spoken a word during their fight or their later flight, was looking around the tap cafe. He looked like an impatient, easily distracted puppy, but Mander realized that he was checking out all the exits and making sure that they had not been followed.
This is what killed my brother,
she said at last. She sounded defeated.
Likely,
said Mander.
There were strange crystals at the corners of your brother's eyes, as well as in his blood.
She ran her hand through her dark blue hair. In a soft voice, she said,
His blood. How was the rest of him? What did you discover when you examined his body?
Mander was surprised by her directness.
I don't know if you would really be comfortable knowing the details.
Tell me,
she snapped, and several heads in the tap cafe turned their way. The Bothan looked at her and frowned. She nodded agreement, then said more quietly,
What else did you find in the body?
Purplish crystals at the corners of the eyes and mouth,
Mander said quickly.
Darkening and expansion of the veins and arteries, in addition to the damage from such a fall. And there was a surprising rigidity in the muscles. He was angry when he died.
The Pantoran slumped in her seat and bowed her head. Mander looked at the now concerned face of the Bothan and back at the Pantoran.
I committed the body to the flames, as is the custom of our order. Had I known you were in the area, I would have waited.
There was no response. Mander tapped the envelope and said,
It is definitely a spice. It dissolves easily and could be put into the scent wine the Rhodian brought him. I think that is how the poison was administered.
Reen Irana's shoulders shook, and at first Mander thought she was sobbing. Instead, he realized that it was a sharp, mocking laugh.
Poison?
She said, and her jaw stiffened.
If only it was simply that.
At once, Mander realized that he had been mistaken. Reen Irana knew something more than he. What had he missed? He decided to wait for the Pantoran to tell him, and the silence grew between them. When she finally spoke, she fought to control her words.
Are you Jedi or this naive? This isn't just a poison, this is a narcotic. A hard version of spice, it's called Tempest.
Mander looked at the packet. Now he regarded it like a serpent as well. Reen leaned forward and continued.
Spacers have been seeing this spice throughout the Spiral Arms, along the Polemian trade route and Hydian Way, even in the corporate sector and Hutt space. It's used either mixed in drinks or as an aerosol. It's a spice, but a nasty one, addictive and destructive. Heavy users are marked by a darkening of the blood vessels. You can see them through the flesh. They also...
She paused for a moment, thinking of her brother before continuing.
Addicts are also prone to fits of uncontrollable rage.
Like that which Toro showed in the restaurant,
Mander said quietly.
It still could have been used as a poison.
Reen shuddered and shook her head.
It wasn't a poisoning. It was an overdose.
Mander blinked. He could not imagine Toro using a dangerous drug. But before he could say anything, Reen continued.
The rage is a symptom of long-term use, as is the darkening of the blood vessels. The last few hollows I've received from Toro, he was angry, upset. He blamed the Jedi for sending him out to the middle of nowhere. He felt he was getting a runaround from his contacts. He sounded bitter, frustrated. It wasn't like him. I didn't think about it at the time, but ran into a mutual friend on Kairin, another Pantoran. The friend said that Toro looked sick and had gotten angry when asked about it.
Sick, Mander said. A statement, not a question. Reen looked away from Mander.
He said that Toro's veins were showing dark through his flesh.
You think he was already addicted?
Said Mander. He felt the air go out of him. It was one thing for young Toro to give in to a momentary flash of anger. It was another if he had been using a drug all this time, without anyone knowing.
No,
he corrected himself, without Mander or the Jedi Council knowing about it. Toro's sister knew, or at least suspected.
I came here to confront him, to find out if he was okay,
she said, making a gesture of frustration.
We were not close. I left for space before he left to join your Jedi, but he was family and I was worried.
And you came here and found that he was dead,
said Mander, hoping his voice covered what he felt inside.
And that another Jedi was here asking after him,
said Reen.
I didn't know if you had been working with him or looking for him as well, or...
She let her voice trail off.
You didn't know if I was the one giving him the Tempest,
said Mander flatly. Reen nodded, her mouth a thin line. Mander said,
Your brother was on Makm-T at the behest of the Jedi Order. That is true. But his assignment had nothing to do with spice in any form.
He was supposed to meet someone in the restaurant,
said the Pantoran.
Probably someone to do with his mission,
said Mander.
Or perhaps his source for the drug,
said Reen. Mander sighed.
Any evidence that would be at the warehouse is gone now. We can probably track down the Bomu clan, though. There aren't many Rhodians on Makm-T.
The Bomu clan is strictly small-time,
said Reen.
They are scattered across a dozen worlds like this. They hire out to just about anyone. They would be middle beings at best,
Mander suggested.
Still, they're our best hope for finding out where this drug, this Tempest, is coming from.
Reen thought for a moment.
It is a pretty large clan and provides muscle throughout the quadrant. Their scams vary from planet to planet, and sometimes different parts of the clan work for rival crime lords. The one thing that pulls them all together is vengeance. Take out one of them, and you can have the entire clan on your back in no time.
I will remember to add them to the list of the Jedi's enemies,
said Mander wryly. The conversation stopped as the waiter, a lumbering Swokes, came with their meals. The waiter also set 3 small iron cups on the table, bubbling with what Mander hoped was an infusion of Ancionian tea, or at least the Makm-T equivalent. Once the waiter left, Mander noticed that the bag containing the Tempest crystals was missing. He looked up sharply at Reen, who was staring into her cup as if the future lay there. Then he looked at the Bothan, who returned his glance with a gangly grin and reached into his vest, producing the envelope, which he handed back to Mander. Mander put the envelope back into his own robe pocket.
Yes, we shouldn't leave things like this out to be found. And thank you for your help in rescuing both of us earlier.
The Bothan raised both hands in an expression of,
What else could I have done?
Reen looked up and said,
Sorry, I didn't make introductions. Eddie Beret here is one of the best mechanics in this part of space. He can hotwire just about everything, from a speeder to a battlecruiser.
Or a manual load lifter,
added Mander.
Does he speak?
Only when I have to,
replied the Bothan in a deep voice with an educated core accent. Despite himself, Mander blinked in surprise. It was not the voice he expected to come out of the furry muzzle of a Bothan.
Erday believes that when you don't say much, people forget about you and they let things slip,
said Reen.
Once he comes to trust you, he's positively chatty.
Again, the Bothan retreated into mime, raising both hands in a comical shrug, and dug into a crate steak. Mander nodded. The intelligence-gathering abilities of the Bothan people were legendary. He turned back to Reen.
What can you tell me about the Tempest drug itself?
Not a lot.
Said Reen.
It showed up less than a year ago, and suddenly it's all over the place. At first it was like any other type of spice, used for medicinal and, recreational purposes.
Mander nodded for her to continue.
Tempest is one of the really bad ones,
said Reen, lowering her voice now and leaning forward.
It's extremely addictive, and long-term users are clearly marked. Like a lot of spice, it makes the user feel good, but at a price.
She paused a moment, then added,
I need to ask. The Jedi in your studies, do you use,
The question surprised Mander Zuma. He pursed his lips and said,
No.
Another silence stretched out between them, and he added,
Some types of spice provide boosts in telepathy or empathy, but always at a cost of control. No Jedi would seriously use spice when dealing with the Force.
Another silence, and even Eddie had stopped eating. Reen's eyes were unfocused, and her mind was wrapped up in a now distant memory. The Jedi could imagine what she was thinking about. Mander added,
I am very sorry about your brother.
Even before I came here,
she said.
I knew I had lost him. I had lost him to his dreams, I had lost him to the Jedi, and I had lost him to the spice.
Toro's mission to Makm-T had nothing to do with spice,
Mander repeated.
He was here to negotiate for a set of space coordinates. I don't know how or why he became involved in Tempest. Regardless, I am sorry.
She looked into the Jedi's unwavering eyes.
I believe you,
said Reen after a moment, and went back to picking at her steak. Then she looked up.
I'm sorry for shooting at you.
You would not be the first,
Mander said. The three ate in silence. After a few moments, Reen said,
Where does that leave us?
Mander suppressed a shrug.
I don't know if it leaves us anywhere. The spice that he used has been destroyed, along with its local distributors. I want to find out where the spice came from, but I also must finish Toro's mission, and I don't know if one is tied to the other. But someone else may want those coordinates, and someone definitely knew about Toro's addiction and deliberately spiked the wine with an overdose. That means I have competition for what I need and must act quickly.
Reen did not look up from her meal. Then, as if realizing something for the first time, she said,
You said he was looking for space coordinates. Doesn't seem like much of a mission for a Jedi.
They are for the Indrexu spiral,
said Mander in a low voice. Both Reen and Eddie looked up, and Reen let out a low whistle.
The Indrexu spiral? That's a knotty bit of space. It's a swirling maelstrom of protostars and dark matter just looking for ships to blow up. Even spacers who make the Kessel Run know better than to try it. Who would have been foolhardy enough to have mapped it?
That I do not know,
said Mander.
But I do know who has the coordinates, and that Toro was supposed to meet with them in orbit above Makm-T.
Reen looked at him thoughtfully.
Once you get the coordinates, you'll need someone who knows the space lanes to confirm them.
I know my galactic navigation,
said Mander.
I've studied the relevant texts on my way here.
Meaning you've never programmed a navicomp, have you?
Reen's eyes lit up.
Probably had some droid do it. It's an art form, you know. You mess up the numbers and, well, it's not pretty, that's all.
Are you volunteering to help?
Asked Mander, and the Bothan made a coughing noise like the steak was going down a breathing tube.
Not volunteering,
said Reen, ignoring her companion.
If Toro was killed for Jedi business, then it makes it my business as well. If someone overdosed or poisoned him to keep him from these coordinates, I'd like to meet them.
And if they decide to come after me, you'd like to be there,
said Mander. Reen gave a shrug and stabbed at the last of her steak.
You're my best lead,
she said.
Do you have a ship?
Asked the Jedi. Rian hesitated with the large forkful of steak and set it down on the iron plate. The Bothan was grinning, but said nothing.
Well,
said the Pantoran, suddenly more circumspect.
Yes and no.
How much yes and how much no?
Asked Mander. Rian said,
There is a ship, the Ambition. But it's not what you would call functional.
The Bothan was making a chuffing noise that Mander could swear was chuckling. It was Mander's turn to raise his eyebrows.
How non-functional is it?
Extremely non-functional,
said the Bothan, and there was clear amusement in his voice.
It is in a couple of pieces,
started Reen.
More than a dozen major ones,
added Eddie.
Not counting the...
A few pieces,
corrected Reen, staring daggers at the Bothan.
Just a few pieces. Back on a landing pad on Kieran. If,
she added quickly, cutting off Eddie Beret.
They haven't sold it off for scrap to pay for the birthing fee.
The Bothan merely smiled and folded his furred hands in front of himself.
Ah,
said Mander.
So you are stranded here. But someone with the coordinates for the Indrexu spiral.
And the ability to check them out.
Rian put in.
Would be able to write their own ticket.
Finished Mander.
Sounds fair enough. Yes, I think an experienced pilot would be helpful. If I get the coordinates and they check out, you can have them as well. The Jedi don't have much in the way of material belongings, so consider it Toro's bequest.
He's giving in too easily,
said the Bothan.
There has to be a catch.
There is,
said Mander.
The catch is the people who have the coordinates, the ones who kept Toro jumping through hoops for weeks.
So my brother was negotiating with tough customers,
said Reen.
How bad can they be?
Mander said.
Toro was negotiating with the Hutts.
Now it was the previously calm Bothan's turn to react, his eyes wide and his fur raised from the crown of his head back along his spine.
You can't be serious,
he managed.
Completely,
said Mander.
I know that the Bothans and the Hutts have bad blood between them, so if you want to back out at this point, I would understand.
Eddie opened his mouth to reply, but Reen beat him to the punch.
Bad blood is not the problem. Bothans and Hutts are natural competitors. The problem is that you can't trust any Hutts. Period.
I believe the one we are dealing with can be trusted,
Mander said. Reen stifled a laugh and said,
The only people who tolerate the Hutts are those who have to work for them. And even then they work very hard to keep them at an arm's length. Every single Hutt is a criminal and a thief. Their entire civilization is built upon the powerful stealing from the weak. They survived the destruction of their original homeworld, Val, and proceeded to steal another one from a less powerful species. Now Nal Hutta is a haven for the crime lords, and its moon, Nar Shaddaa, is rife with corruption.
Granted,
said Mander.
But the Old Republic dealt with the Hutts when they had to, and in this case, the benefits were considered worth it. And if all Hutts are untrustworthy, that means you can depend on what they will do.
They are predictable,
said Eddie Beret.
That's a far cry from dependable.
You're making a mistake dealing with them in the first place,
said Reen.
If you want my professional opinion.
And in your long experience,
said Mander.
You've never dealt with Hutts.
That's the point,
countered Reen.
I have. And it is a job best done through middle beings and fixers with strong stomachs and weak morals. It is not a question of if a Hutt will betray you, but when.
So you're saying no then?
Mander asked with a sigh. Eddie made to say something, but Reen overrode him again.
I'm saying that you had best be careful. They're not like most of the other sentients you encounter out here on the Rim. Their brains don't even work the same way as everyone else's,
she said.
And they're resistant to your Jedi mind tricks.
I have reliable information to that effect,
said Mander.
I believe that it is one reason they are willing to deal with the Order. They feel we are at a disadvantage in negotiations, both with our limited ability to affect them and our tendency to deal with people fairly.
In other words, you are predictable,
muttered Eddie. Reen ignored him.
They will stab you in the back at the first hint of a profit. And Hutt's deal in spice,
she said firmly.
They do,
said Mander.
So the question is, do these Hutts deal in that type of spice?
Reen bit her lip, and the Bothan watched her as the wheels turned. At length, she said,
"Do you think that this is responsible for my brother's death?"
Mander shook his head.
You said that, not me. I don't have enough information one way or another. A rival group may be after the coordinates, and they may be the ones that gave your brother the overdose. Or it may be for some other matter he was investigating. Toro's reports were brief, so it could be that he became involved in investigating this Tempest himself. In any event, I can use someone who understands the possible perils, and you seem to meet that requirement. Are you still interested?
Reen looked at Eddie, and if the Bothan communicated anything to the Pantoran, it eluded Mander's senses. But after a moment, she nodded.
We're in. Tell us about this trustworthy Hutt that you poor naive Jedi have been dealing with.
These Hutts belong to the Hutt clan. Have you heard of them?
Both of them looked at him blankly.
They are not one of the ruling clans, but are on the next level down, socially. The patriarch is Popara Hutt, and he is the one who has the navigation codes.
Any idea where he got these codes in the first place?
Said Reen.
No,
said Mander.
Although it's not hard to speculate. The Hutt are a trading clan, and apparently spend a great deal of effort in discovering new items and markets. The idea that someone in his employ discovered,
or stole,
or otherwise acquired the codes is not beyond reason.
Popara and the Hutt have a good reputation.
Continued Mander, adding quickly.
Good, obviously being relative when dealing with Hutts. He is ancient in Hutt terms and has built a reputation for straightforward trade. From all our reports, he is sharp but honest in his dealings, and always gets what he wants. He pays his people well, and has a surprising amount of loyalty.
Luxury,
said Eddie Beret, and the other two looked at him. The Bothan finished the last of his meal and said,
Hutts would see loyalty, and are treating one's workers well, as a luxury. As much a status symbol as a humanoid dance slave or a storied piece of hollow art. If this trustworthy Hutt cannot own entire planets, the ability to engage in such extravagant actions would be a conspicuous display of power.
Mander nodded.
I had not considered that as a possibility.
Reen put in,
Keep this in mind. The Hutts have no words in their language for thank you. The best they can manage is Bargon Unoa a Uyachitaguma. Your services will be rewarded.
I know enough Hutt-Ts to get by,
said Mander.
Even taught a bit to your brother. That is one of the reasons why he was chosen for this particular mission.
Despite himself, Mander frowned at the reminder of sending Toro off. He pressed on.
Regardless, Popara Hutt has a good reputation, and I think we can trust him.
Rayan looked at Mander a long moment, her head tilted. At last she said,
What kind of Jedi are you?
Mander blinked for a moment, confused by the question.
What do you mean?
Reen's eyes narrowed.
You didn't know about the Tempest. And you're negotiating for a set of space coordinates, with a Hutt. A Hutt that you're willing to trust.
Your brother was willing to trust this Hutt,
said Mander calmly, his face a mask now, belying his irritation.
And look where that got him,
she retorted. Then she realized what she had said. A shocked look crossed her face, and she turned away. Mander was unsure what to say. He looked at Eddie Beret, and the Bothan nodded at him to continue.
A Jedi goes where he is needed,
said Mander.
Your brother, regardless of his fate, knew this. I taught him that, as I myself was taught. I will finish Toro's task and, if I can, bring those responsible for his death to justice. I would appreciate your help.
He looked at the Bothan.
Both of you.
Rien looked up and pushed the night blue hair back across her forehead.
You'll need our help if you're going to survive out here in the real world. You have to drive a hard bargain with the Hutts. Anyone who would trust a Hutt needs someone to keep them from walking into walls or falling down a well. It might as well be us.
The Bothan nodded, and Mander said,
Very well then. Welcome aboard.
Rien leaned forward on the table and templed her fingers together. She said,
So when do we meet this good Hutt of yours?
First thing tomorrow,
said Mander.
Popara's yacht should pull into orbit this evening. I am supposed to meet his factorum at the starport at dawn. Berth Y-27. Meet me there, and you'll get a chance to draw your own conclusions.
Chapter 3. Popara the Hutt.
Yuba Sanuba Choramond,
said the Hutt factorum, looking at the trio over the top of a heavy set of data goggles. At the Hutt's side, a protocol droid made of greenish metal translated.
You said you would be coming alone,
it said in a neutral voice, lacking inflection.
Do the Hutts consider members of one's entourage as independent beings?
Countered Mander, his face an unconcerned mask. He had reviewed the available volumes on Hutt customs and society before he had left Yavin 4.
Or are they merely extensions of one's own will?
The factorum had a greenish cast to its flesh, and its long lashes batted at Rien, Mander, and Eddie. A female, realized Mander, or rather a Hutt in female state. The great slug-like creatures could be either gender and manifested secondary sexual traits differently throughout their lives. The idea of calling one male or female was usually left to the observer. The Hutts themselves seemed to be unconcerned about whether they were male or female at any moment. Indeed, many of their titles, such as Lorda or Master, were considered gender-neutral. This one's head seemed to be narrower and taller than most as well, looking more like a spear point than a flattened triangle. She continued, speaking in the sibilant tongue of Hutt-Tese.
Indeed, Chuba Shadow Futu Stuka de Planeto.
and you are the previous Jedi's replacement in the negotiations.
Translated, the droid, an H-Series 3PO unit. The Hutt's lackadaisical manner indicated that she didn't care if he was or not.
I was his teacher,
said Mander,
and I came to finish the task he was assigned.
The factorum punched a few toggles on her pad, then adjusted her data goggles up over her eyes. The goggles' oversized lenses made her eyes look huge, even for a Hutt. Surprisingly, the next time she spoke, it was in basic, albeit in a halting fashion that communicated nothing so much as distaste for doing so, as if the words were bitter in her mouth.
I am Vargo Gajali. I am Mighty Popara's Chief Advisor, Major Domo and Factotum. Benevolent Popara is very busy, so most of your dealing will be with me. Treat me with the respect that wise Popara has earned.
Of course,
said Mander, and the Hutt turned and slithered toward the shuttle. Mander turned to the others and was struck by the scowls they both wore.
You can still stay behind,
he suggested.
I would not miss this for all the spice on Ryloth,
said Rien.
Just remember, let me do the talking,
Mander said.
Later, I will ask about your impressions.
They boarded the ship, and Mander watched the jade-green 3PO unit organizing the stowage of supplies. Rantweed clusters, pickled zog, Noric loaves, and many kegs of Kashyyyk ale. The last was interesting, even in the larder of a Hutt epicure. The shuttle lifted off smoothly from the spaceport, the ship helmed by a team of Glusses Nikto. The Pale Nikto spoke to one another in a low, atonal language, but reported to Vago in Huttese. Mander did not doubt for a moment that the Factorum was fluent in Nikto as well as in Basic, and did not doubt that she would rather sprain her tongue than speak it. The Hutt settled herself onto a great cushion along the back wall of the ship and busied herself with her datapad and goggles. It was as if Mander Zuma and his entourage had ceased to exist, having no more importance than the ale kegs. Mander watched the sprawl of the tract, the unlimited graveyard of Makm-T, extend out to the horizon as the shuttle rose. To Vago, he said,
"We appreciate benevolent Popara's willingness to continue negotiations in this matter, even after Toro Irana's passing.
Juba kanki chitagusha kospab, te bezga Jedi stuka funta umdoale chuba higavisa eniki."
Vago responded without looking up from her pad, the droid translating.
You may thank efficient and diligent Vago for that kindness. Most of the negotiations were through her offices. The previous Jedi was fairly effective, and the offer tendered through him remains sufficient regardless of who offers it.
Rian looked at the Hutt.
Then you knew you knew the previous Jedi.
Vago looked up at Rian and blinked, her eyes magnified beneath the data goggles. She looked at Mander, as if expecting him to cuff an insolent subordinate for speaking out of turn. When the older Jedi did not, she huffed and muttered a reply in Huttese. The droid translating.
He dealt through our agents, and I believe he met both of Popara's spawn at one time or another. He never met gentle and wise Popara, if that is what you are getting at. He was fairly effective, as I said.
She then returned to whatever she had on her datapad. The Pale Nikto crew droning in their native languages as the ground dropped away beneath them. Eddie remained quiet, taking everything in. Rian and Mander watched the sky darken beyond the viewports and the tomb-dotted horizon turn into a planetary curve. There was a sparkle about the edge of the curve, which grew as they approached from a solitary pip of light into the dagger shape of an Ubrikian space yacht. The long, tapered bow cut like a knife blade among the stars, and the navigation spars bracketed the 4 rear engines. This was an air-breathing craft, and could land on a planet, should Popara Huttese ever deign to put common dirt beneath his belly. Even so, the ship was buffed to a reflective brilliance. Mander did not doubt that there were at least half a dozen turbo blasters concealed along the length of the bow, and that the shuttle was being tracked in the yacht's crosshairs as they approached. Vago snapped off her datapad and readjusted her goggles.
Imru Utmian,
she said, then translated in Basic.
The Wandering Outlander.
Then she barked an order in Huttese, and the shuttle nestled itself at the belly of the yacht. The hissing of seals confirmed the docking, and Vago led the group to the lift tube, the green droid fussing among the Pale Nikto behind them, readying the cargo for transfer. The lift tube itself was opulent, with mirrored walls, mosaic crystal floors, and door irises made of musk wood. Vago seemed supremely disinterested in both her surroundings and her companions. The door hissed to a stop and spiraled open. The hatch revealed the hulking form of a Wookiee, who pushed his way into the tube without waiting for the others to depart. Rian and Mander stepped back, but Eddie held his ground, and the Wookiee was brought up short, towering over the smaller Bothan. The two locked eyes, and for that long moment, it looked like the Wookiee would attack. Mander could smell the alcohol on the Wookiee's breath, and realized that this was why they were bringing on more ale from Kashyyyk. Finally, the Bothan stepped away and let the Wookiee shamble in, away from the hut. For her part, Vago slipped past the drunken Wookiee and shepherded the others down the hall.
"One of young Zonos' companions,"
she said, without further explanation, biting off the words in Huttese.
"There will be others on board."
The end of the hallway was another great door of musk wood, this one with settings of silver. Another green 3PO unit, this one a bit more dented and battered, stood by the door. Apparently, thought Mander, it hadn't gotten out of the Wookiee's way in time.
"Announce us,"
Vago said in Huttese, and the protocol droid snapped to attention and hand-palmed the lock, the hatch irising silently outward. In basic, the droid crackled.
"His most mighty and powerful lord, his most wise and generous master, his most understanding and thoughtful leader, Popara Huttese, Popara the Hutt."
The room was dark in the manner that Hutts preferred, and wafted with the smells of smoke and slightly spoiled meat. The room itself was hut-sized, with 3 great alcoves along the other walls. All 3 were sumptuously furnished with rich tapestries and thick cushions. Mander noted briefly that the one on their left was empty, but the one on their right held a large young Hutt, laughing with a trio of Wookiees. Empty kegs and used hokum pipes were scattered about, but he had scant time to take that in, for Popara, the Hutt, occupied the central alcove. Mander knew that Popara was old, 9 centuries if the data disks had been correct, and had the wiliness of one who'd had to fight to survive every year. Hutts grew continuously throughout their entire lives, and Popara was enormous, his flesh marked with gray patches and old whitened scars of earlier conflicts. His eyes, though, were as brilliant as a morning on Yavin 4. 3 green-hued Twi'lek females in long, diaphanous robes dabbed him with perfumed sponges, and one of them broke from her ministries as the massive Hutt let out a low, almost animal growl.
"Shobaso Jedi,"
said the old Hutt, and the floor itself vibrated from the deepness of his voice.
"Wise Popara bids you welcome,"
said the Twi'lek, flashing sharpened teeth as she spoke.
Dobra Grandio Malorda Popara Huttese,
said Mander Zuma, wrapping his tongue around the difficult glottal stops of the Huttese.
I am honored, my lord Popara Huttese.
The great Hutt made a deep, rumbling comment.
"Uyat,"
and the Twi'lek handmaidens giggled. The tallest one said,
"He says that your accent is horrible. He understands your language, and it is apparent you understand his. Shall I continue to translate for you and spare you further embarrassment?"
Please,
said Mander.
For the sake of my companions, if not just clarity for me.
Another flash of sharpened teeth, and the Hutt made another deep comment.
Puissant Popara declares that the offer the new Jedi Order has made for the coordinates of the Indrexu spiral is sufficient.
I am pleased that it is so, and appreciate Popara's willingness to part with it.
Mander nodded. Another deep rumble, which the Twi'lek translated as,
Knowledge is like water, hard to contain once it has been unleashed. Though he notes that if you have a Bothan in your party, such knowledge will not be kept secret long.
She looked daggers at Eddie, who merely held up both palms in that
Who, me?
response that Mander had already become accustomed to. Mander started to say that the coordinates would help greatly, but the ancient Hutt let out a string of belches.
Sage Popara would, however, like to expand the deal we have agreed to. Mighty Popara bids you serve his family.
Here it comes,
said Rian under her breath. Mander ignored her.
Please continue.
A long string of Hutt-Ts followed, sounding like a hot spring covered with mud.
Planito Endregatsos Titan CSA se Hatshu, Kumakemila Kila, Mi Naga Hopa Huha.
The Twi'lek's forehead creased as she sought to remember it all.
Concerned Popara notes that there is a plague on the planet Endregad, on the far side of the Indrexu spiral. The world is close to the corporate sector authority, and the CSA has placed it under quarantine, interdicting all ships in and out. The plight of the Endregadi has touched beneficent Popara's heart, and he wishes to make a gift of medicinal spice to the world. The CSA will have nothing to do with dealing with Hutts, and Popara regrets that their lack of appreciation may cause greater suffering. You will be provided a ship carrying the spice with the coordinates already locked into the computer.
Mander shot Rian a look at the mention of spice, and the spacer's eyes were wide. She started to say something, but was drowned out by the return of the Wookiee from the lift tube. The huge creature bearing a keg of ale underneath each burly arm and shouting a welcoming cry. The other Wookiees in the smaller Hutt's alcove responded in kind, and Mander took the opportunity to touch Rian on the shoulder and shake his head. The Factorum Vago might tolerate such an interruption, the Sheikh said, but it would be unlikely that Popara would, despite his stated benevolence. For his part, the older Hutt unleashed a caustic tirade of abusive gutturals at the Wookiees and the younger Hutt.
Bosca, Nira desa slimo wermo, Ichuta, Yig, Batamidichu dajikava.
While the Twi'lek did not translate any of the exchange, Mander did not need to know Hutt-Ts to understand a parent berating a misbehaving child. The younger Hutt looked wounded, and he and the Wookiees settled into muttering, the new returnee pointing at Eddie in particular. Addressing the Twi'lek, Mander said,
On behalf of the Jedi and all caring and concerned peoples of the galaxy, we thank Popara for his generosity, but question his interest in but one planet, and inquire if there is not something else he needs us to be aware of.
The Twi'lek took a short, insulted intake of breath, but the ancient Hutt let out a deep sigh and spoke in a low tone to his translator.
Popara stukab quick spawna fisi, zonos saeldi.
Who then addressed Mander.
Mighty Popara has seen 2 of his spawn grow to maturity. Zonos here is the elder of the 2.
She made an almost imperceptible head nod toward the Hutt and his Wookiee entourage.
His youngest child is Mika. Mika Hutese was on Endregad when the plague hit, and the CSA interdicted the world. There has been no word of him since then, and Popara, a caring parent, is concerned. The child is impetuous.
Mander nodded and said,
I understand his concern for one of a younger generation. We will be glad to see delivery of the medical supplies and determine what happened to your son.
We keep the ship.
Rian interrupted. Mander shot her a sudden, shocked look, but the older Hutt merely chortled.
Of course,
said the Twi'lek.
when gracious Popara expanded the deal, he meant to expand both the risk and the reward. The ship will be more than sufficient payment for this favor.
Popara the Hutt shifted forward on his cushions, his great girth hanging over the sides, towering over Mander and the others like an avalanche of flesh. His eyes softened, and for a moment he looked very, very old and alone. In a quiet voice he said, in Basic,
"Bring me back my son."
Then he settled back, and it was as if the moment had not happened. He was no longer a concerned father, merely a Hutt employer. Two of the robed Twi'leks dabbed at him with scented fluids, and the third asked,
Are you amenable to this addendum?
We will do our best,
said Mander.
Vago Gajali will see to your needs,
said the Twi'lek, and the great Hutt closed his eyes to mere slits, a sign that the audience was at an end.
Barganu Noah Auyat,
Popara said, by way of benediction, translated as, You will be rewarded.
Your thanks, the coordinates, and the ship are reward enough,
said Mander. He turned, leading the two others through the musk wood doors. In the hallway, the H3PO unit directed them down to a meeting room. Rian leaned in close to Mander and said,
I told you that you need to drive a hard bargain with the Hutts.
and I told you,
said Mander,
to let me do the talking.
The briefing room was better lit, but equally sumptuous, with raised ramps along one wall and a table and chairs more suitable for hominids in the center. Tasteful but opulent statues stood in niches along one wall. Rian examined one made of a rose-colored mineral depicting an incongruous Hutt emerging from a sweeping fountain of water. Rian reached out to touch a finger to the delicately carved foam. Vago, behind them, spat out a string of Hutties.
Sungwonki Popara Pipcha Spauna Mika, Ganda Do Effigy Fufirfig.
The slightly dented green H3PO unit trailed after her like a moon in the Hutt's tidal wake. The droid said,
That statue was presented to mighty Popara to commemorate the successful birth of his youngest child, Mika. It is carved of a single emeraldite crystal. Such statuary would often be protected by virulent contact poisons, but that one has been detoxified.
Despite the non-toxic assurance, Rian pulled back her hand. Vago ignored her and moved over to the table, toggling a switch. A hollow display illuminated the schematics of a ship in the center of the table. It was shaped like a blunted arrowhead.
This vessel is waiting at landing pad X-13 on Makm-T,
said Vago through the droid.
It is being loaded as we speak.
Rian's attention was on the ship at once, the statue now forgotten.
That's a Suwantech TL-1200 freighter,
she said.
Dependable model, easily modded and customized. Can be handled solo, but flies better with a crew. 2 quad laser turrets. No custom work that I can see. Bit dinged up. It will do.
She nodded her approval to Mander.
Better condition than our last ship,
muttered Eddie, punching up a detailed schematic. Vago ignored both of them and handed Mander a datapad. The droid translated.
The medicinal spice will be loaded into the aft compartments. We don't know the specific details of the plague itself, so the spice is a broadband antisporant and pain suppressor.
Rian's head popped up from checking the ship's stats. Mander saw her jaw tighten slightly as she asked,
Does All-Wise Popara do a lot of trade in spice?
Vago looked over her data goggles at the Pantoran, then shrugged. The droid translated without comment.
Some mostly medicinal. This is not the first time Great Popara has directed spice to handle a crisis. He also ships glitter stim when he chooses to speculate on the market.
Nothing. Worse?
Said Rian. She tried to keep the words light, but Mander could see the shadow of a disapproving frown. The Hutt Factorum's eyes narrowed, and the droid hesitated before translating.
No. Benevolent Popara chooses not to deal in slaves or in hard spices. He sees that there is enough misery in the galaxy without adding to it, and enough opportunity that he may gain wealth without contributing to that misery.
Regardless,
said Mander,
I think we should check the cargo before we get to Endrigod. It would be embarrassing to be found running contraband. The CSA in particular takes a dim view of spice smugglers.
Vago made a chuffing noise.
Understood,
said the droid, taking the data pad from the Jedi. It handed the pad to Vago, who punched a few more buttons and handed it back.
This clears you to access the crates and allows you to determine that they are what we claim them to be.
I am sorry if I sound untrusting,
said Mander. Vago's face was a blank, offering no more clue to her thoughts than the droid translator.
Not at all. Hutts have a, shall we say, reputation in such things. One assumes that all Hutts are criminals, just as all Bothans are spies.
Despite himself, Mander shot a glance at Eddie, who was poring over the ship's schematics and paying no apparent attention to any of them. Rian had joined him in investigating the plans.
Wise Popara is no fool,
Vago continued through the droid.
He has survived clan wars and assassination attempts and has found a position of strength in honesty. That is one reason to deal with the Jedi. Your order does not leap to conclusions quite as rapidly as others.
We try to keep open minds,
said Mander. Vago let out a snort and spoke in Hutt-Tese, holding up a hand to instruct the droid not to translate for the others. In Hutt-Tese, she said,
Pity that the CSA does not follow your example. We have hit a wall dealing with them. Zonos himself has taken over the negotiations and hasn't gotten much farther. In the meantime, Popara is distracted by his missing son and the business suffers. And that makes it my worry.
Said Mander in Basic.
You are not worried about Mika?
I worry about Popara and his lineage,
said Vago, choosing her words carefully. To Mander, it seemed that the Hutt wanted him to hear the words without going through a translator.
Benevolent Popara inspires loyalty and hopes to make that loyalty his gift to his children. Zonos is more typical of our species, but Mika has potential. I think that is why Popara is concerned.
You are not Huttese clan, are you?
Asked Mander. He shot a glance at his two companions, but they were still looking at the schematics. He wondered idly if the Bothan understood Hutt-Tese.
You know, I was spawned of the Gejali family,
said Vago.
I am not familiar with that clan,
said Mander.
Because I am the only one in it,
said Vago, her face expressionless.
I said that Popara has survived numerous clan wars. The Gejalis were among the clans that confused openness for weakness and sought to defeat the Huttises. I am the survivor.
Mander raised an eyebrow.
And yet you work for him?
Vago let out a deep sigh, and for a moment the officious mask of the majordomo slipped.
I was but a child, and by rights and tradition, Popara could have ended my life. Instead, he brought me in and trained me as his own. I owe him much, and I want to see his true child return to him. It is difficult to explain to an Outlander.
We Outlanders understand more than you think,
said Mander.
One last question. Why was Mika on Endrigod in the first place?
From the corner of his eye, Mander noticed the Bothan's head come up a bit. Eddie was definitely listening now. Vago stiffened slightly and lowered her hand, allowing the droid to resume its translation, the air of familiarity gone once more.
Family business. One of our many holdings is Skydove Freight. The office is in Telbolin, the main colony on the planet. Mika was negotiating with geode miners. A small task, but Popara wants his children to understand the business. No one anticipated the plague or the quarantine.
Does the other son Zonos do small tasks as well?
Asked Mander.
Sometimes,
said Vago through the droid, and then allowed herself a deep chuckle.
If they are not too complicated.
Will the CSA be expecting us?
No. We offered aid, but they turned it down,
said Vago, again speaking in basic.
And they will not be expecting it this soon in any event, as a normal ship would have to go around the spiral. They will probably have at least one ship in orbit, and knowing the CSA, it's probably an old rust bucket with limited maneuverability, but enough ordnance to start a small war.
That would be expected with the corporate sector,
said Mander.
The coordinates should bring you in on the far side of the system. Prescient Vago recommends you run the blockade.
Translated the H3PO unit.
Use some of the medicine to bribe the local officials on the ground. If you need to, offer the remaining spice to the CSA by way of an apology later. The plague is truly secondary compared with the safety of a Huttese scion.
Mander nodded. Popara may be described as benevolent, wise, and kindly, but the fate of a world would not matter next to Mika.
The Huttese family leaves such matters to your discretion,
spoke the droid.
And you will need to be vaccinated, of course. Vago will summon a medical droid. If you need anything else, this unit will see to your needs.
Not waiting for the droid to finish, Vago Gajali slithered through the door.
Do we have enough information?
Asked Mander. Rien had been drawn into the schematics. The Bothan looked up and saw Mander pointing to the walls and to the droid. The Bothan nodded. Both of them assumed listening devices in the walls, and droids had big receptors.
A moment, Jedi,
said the droid.
There is someone else who would speak with you.
Vago will be back soon enough, but I think we are available,
said Mander.
Not the others, I'm afraid,
said the droid, looking at the Bothan.
Just the Jedi, for a moment.
Mander looked at Eddie, and the Bothan shrugged. The Jedi left Eddie and Rien going over the manifest and followed the droid across the hall. The warm room was dimly lit and stank worse than the grand meeting room. As soon as he entered, 2 Wookiees closed in behind him, blocking the door. 2 more flanked the elder son, Zonos, sprawled on a repulsor lift couch. The hairs on the back of Mander's neck stood up in a way that they had not in the presence of the older Hutt. The younger creature was in better shape, and although smaller, he seemed more malignant than his parent. His flesh had a bluish sheen, and even in this light, Mander could see that his eyes were red and rheumy. Too much of the Hakum.
Mighty Zonos, may his digestion always be sound,
said the droid, and the Wookiees behind them gave a laugh. Mander said nothing, and Zonos spat out a string of guttural noises, rounded by drink and almost impossible for Mander to translate. The droid put in,
Kindly Zonos wants to wish you good luck on your mission and tell you that he has no hard feelings over an outlander being chosen to aid the family. This is a dangerous situation, and Zonos wants you to know you have the support of the clan.
I appreciate kindly Zonos' concern, and that of Clan Hutt,
said Mander. Another slurred garble, and the droid hesitated. One of the Wookiees smacked it across the back of the head, and it spat out.
Mighty Zonos wants you to know that even if you fail to find his brother or, Ardos forbid, are too late to save him, you will still have an ally among the Hutt.
Zonos waited for the droid to finish, then managed a lazy, single wink. It laughed, and for a moment, Mander's blood ran cold. Then the Wookiees grabbed Mander by the shoulders and forcefully escorted both him and the droid back into the hallway.
That went better than usual,
said the droid, touching its head casing where the Wookiee had smacked it.
Let us get back to the others.
When they returned, both Rhiann and Eddie were rubbing their shoulders from the ball-shaped medical droid, administering a vaccination with a wicked-looking needle. Vago had returned as well.
Where did you disappear to?
Asked the Hutt in her native language.
Zonos wanted to talk to me,
said Mander, not waiting for the droid to translate. He figured that direct honesty was the best approach. Vago would cross-examine the droid in any event. The Hutt factorum harumphed and said in rapid Huttese,
Then I should make this a double dose. Exposure to Zonos is sometimes fatal. I have included information on Endragard, Mika, the disease itself, and what we know about the quarantine blockade.
Vago focused Mander's attention so that he did not notice the ball droid swooping around and quickly injecting him with a vaccine.
There should be no problems with the vaccine,
Vago said. She looked at the Bothan and added,
If there are any odd symptoms, contact us at once. The 3PO unit will see you are returned to the spaceport.
Eddie just growled at Vago's back as the Hutt left. The medical droid swept up behind her.
What just happened?
Said Rhiann.
Let's talk about it later,
said Mander.
Are you ready to go?
I've got a ship. I've got a cargo. And I've got a lot of questions to be answered,
said Rhiann.
Ready as I'll ever be. I've even named the ship.
Oh, what's that?
A new ambition,
said Rhiann with a smile.
Just ignore the fact,
added Eddie,
that the old ambition is now so much scrap. Otherwise, it is not an auspicious name at all.
The one you hunt is named Mander Zuma,
said Coax to the ghostly image.
He is a Jedi of middling years and equally middling ability. Unlike most of his breed, he is surprisingly light in legends of daring that seem to accrete to these monks. He is, in short, a nondescript, hardly a challenge for one such as yourself.
Across from the Klatooinian hovered the image of Hedu, matriarch of the Bomu clan. She was a thin, wasp-like female, made even more ethereal by the holographic projection. Behind her lurked the flickering of others, shifting just at the edges of the image field. relatives acting as bodyguards in the Rhodian fashion. The Rhodian matriarch let out a long, wheezing sigh. She contained more air than her phantom image suggested. Even so, she managed to exhale a question.
You are sure he is the one? The one who killed my clan children on Makm-T?
I have confirmed it,
said Coax politely.
He made little point in concealing his identity, as the Jedi priests are wont to do. He apparently was the teacher of the other Jedi, the one you poisoned.
On your orders,
said Hedu.
On the orders of the Spice Lord,
said Coax, pulling her authorization around her like a cloak. The Rhodian matriarch made a gurgling, chugging noise that Coax assumed was laughter.
Perhaps the Jedi hunts for his own vengeance.
Coax considered the Rhodian's worldview one of continual revenge against slights real and imagined, and thought that, in this case, it had merit.
Perhaps,
she said.
One of his companions, definitely so.
You have learned of his companions?
Said the Rhodian, her trumpet-belled antennae practically quivering.
A Panteran spacer, Rien Irana,
said Coax.
Sister to the Jedi we had killed.
The matriarch let out a long, angry hiss, and Coax wondered if the Rhodian leader had been dipping into her own private spice supplies.
Yes, that makes sense. The Jedi seeks vengeance and brings along others of a similar mind.
From everything that Coax had learned, that seemed unlikely, but she said nothing to dissuade the Rhodian.
And a Bothan. They were the ones who killed your clan children and burned your stocks.
Bothan?
Said the Rhodian and let out a string of curses.
You can always find one of them wherever there is trouble. Where are they now?
They are guests of a Hutt clan lord, aboard his yacht, in orbit over Makm-T,
said Coax. The matriarch stroked a few long hairs on her chin.
A carefully timed shuttle, loaded with explosives, could bring down any yacht.
No,
said Coax.
That will not do.
The matriarch seethed through the holographic connection.
The Jedi has killed my clan children. Nothing else should stand in the way of vengeance.
They are on a Hutt ship,
said Coax calmly.
Do you think that the protection that my lord offers is sufficient to protect you from a Hutt patriarch? It is bad enough that we have to worry about the Jedi Order. I do not want a Hutt mercantile clan prying into our business.
The ancient Rhodian rocked back, hissing in displeasure, and almost disappeared from the holographic view entirely. Coax wondered if the refusal to condone the bombing had given the old raptor an aneurysm. The Rhodian recovered herself, though, measuring her words as carefully as if they were grains of Tempest itself. She said,
What would you have us do?
I want your vow that you will not act against the Hutts,
said Coax.
As long as we have a chance against the Jedi and his allies,
responded the matriarch.
Fair enough,
said the Klatooinian. Her long fingers danced over the keys of the display.
They are making for the Endregad system in a Suwantek freighter. I am giving you the coordinates where they should appear.
Matriarch Hedu's eyes lit up at the sight of the figures, and Coax remembered that the ancient bird had been a spacer as well. She probably could outfly most of her clan.
I know these coordinates. Who is this Jedi that he walks such secret paths?
One favored by a Hutt consortium,
said Coax.
And for that reason, if for no other, you should tread carefully. Intercept their ship on the way in. Do not do anything that would bring the Hutts down on top of our profitable trade.
Hedu chugged a deep laugh again.
Because our Spice Lord does not want to share with the Hutts, I suppose.
You may suppose as you see fit,
said Coax, covering her lies with a thin smile. Someone to the right of the old woman handed her a data pad.
Endregard,
she said, scanning the information.
Core are all over it. Quarantined, interdicted, bad business.
All the more reason to catch their ship on the way in and leave nothing but debris for the corporate sector to find.
Coax glared at the matriarch with her good eye.
Are we agreed?
Matriarch Hedu of the Bomu clan pulled her snout inward, trying to physically stave off her acquiescence as long as she could. At last, she said,
We are agreed. I can have one of our raiders in that sector within the day. There will be no survivors.
Good,
said Coax, and reached to disengage the screen. Before she could do so, though, Hedu added quickly,
I have but one question.
Yes,
said Coax, her own patience thin now. It was always the last question, the last bit of information that created new problems. Thinking of the late Dejaro, whose death was now laid at the feet of the Jedi, Coax realized it must be a genetic tick of the clan to ask one question too many. But the matriarch just smiled.
How did you discover all this information? Names, ship ID, coordinates? You must have some contacts among their Hutt patrons to know all this.
The Spice Lord is mighty,
said Coax,
with a great reach and powerful allies. Keep that in mind if you choose to go beyond my orders.
And with that, she broke the connection and the horrid, reed-thin Rhodian flashed out of existence. Coax let out a deep sigh. Would that all of her problems could disappear so easily? Tempest was now extant on 100 worlds, and while the Spice Lord had proven capable of meeting that great demand, there were always small matters to deal with. The local authorities, rival gangs, nosy interlopers trying to create or steal their own supply. 100 worlds, 100 tasks too small for the Spice Lord, but fit entirely for that most trusted servant, Coax, the one-eyed Clatuinian. She turned back to her guest in the small room, a deactivated 3PO unit, its metallic casing the color of the green evening sky on her homeworld was partially collapsed in one chair. Hours before, she had borrowed it from its Huttese masters as it oversaw the loading of medical supplies for Endregard. She had walked up to it, asked it for directions, and then spoke the override code that the Spice Lord had given her. The 3PO unit froze up for a moment, then entered into a fugue state. After that, it had easily allowed Coax to walk it to a quiet quarter and find out what was going on aboard Popara Hutase's ship. Then she let it collapse in the chair while she did business with Matriarch Hedu. She spoke another series of words now, and the droid reactivated, its eyes lighting up and its body suddenly shocking itself out of its dormant state.
I'm sorry,
it said, then repeated itself as its diagnostics kicked in.
I'm sorry. One moment. Something has gone wrong. Was I offline?
I think so,
said Coax.
I found you wandering near the landing bays about an hour ago. You seemed confused. Do you remember who you are?
I am an H-3PO unit in service of the Hutt clan. I report to Vago Gajali. I am charged with...
It paused for a moment and looked at Coax.
Do I know you?
I don't think so,
said Coax.
I brought you here and was just about to crack your housing and see if anything had worked loose.
She held up a pair of calipers as proof of her intentions.
Then you started up again on your own. You gave me a start.
Oh,
said the droid, adding that information to its data files.
I need to return to my post. They will be missing me.
I don't doubt they will,
said Coax.
Should I take you back to where I found you?
The droid tilted its head slightly, then shook it.
I need to return to my post. They will be missing me.
Gently, it rocked forward and rose, as if trying to regain its bearings. It waddled to the door in the shuffle that all protocol droids seemed cursed with. It turned at the last moment and said,
Thank you.
Do not mention it,
said Coax.
But do yourself a favor and have your master run a full scan on you. Some of your couplings may be loose.
The droid nodded and was gone, back to oversee the loading, its newly rebooted subroutine still trying to understand what had happened to it. Coax had no doubt that the droid would remember nothing. She had done this before, but the slightest glimmer of possible recognition made her uncomfortable. She went to the door and watched the droid move through the crowds of Swokes and other aliens, its movements getting more sure as it went. No, there would be no problem. One more of the 100 things that had to be handled on the behalf of Coax's lord. Perhaps there would be a day where it would all just move smoothly. The arrival of the pallets of pressed and cut drugs, the distribution, the credits, trickling back up on through a dozen false fronts. Perhaps the Spice Lord would not need a fixer, a repair woman, someone who had the ability and cold-hearted resolve to do what needed to be done to keep everything moving smoothly.
It would be nice if it happened even for one day,
Coax realized. But it was an unlikely dream, and the Klatooinian returned to her 100 other tasks.
Chapter 4. To the Plague Planet.
That evening, Mander Zuma had a familiar dream, one that returned to him again and again over the years. He was on Coruscant, in the great Jedi library, situated near the flat-topped peak of the Jedi Temple. Here were the computer terminals, here the hallways leading to the holocron vaults, here the long shelves of holographic records, here the busts of the Lost 20, Jedi who had left the Order. Yet something was wrong. The great vaulted rooms were empty, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled in long, heavy peals. In the dream, he walked. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes it only felt like hours. He met no one. Was this when the library was shut down, during the time of the Galactic Empire, when only the Emperor had access to the stacks, corrupting its volumes to meet his infernal needs? Was it sometime later? Where were the other Jedi? Would he find Master Tion here? But there was nothing except his own footsteps and the sound of the bell. And then he noticed that the glowing holo records of the stacks were slowly going out. Darkness was overtaking them, their blue illumination swallowed by oblivion. Turning, he saw that the rooms behind him were consumed by darkness that had now caught up with him. Around him, the hollow records were dying. Mander, in his dream, reached for his lightsaber, and it felt scaly and cold in his hand. Looking down, he saw that it had been replaced by a serpent, which now coiled around his wrist. The snake opened its mouth, and in the place of fangs there were twin lightsabers, glowing with a deep ruby light. And then he awoke, and he was on Makm-T again, the heavy sun just poking up over the horizon and flooding his room. He blinked and gathered himself. The dream was the same, and it left him with the same feeling each time, a feeling of sadness or insufficiency. Was there something he could have done in the dream? Was there something that he should have done? It did not feel prophetic, but rather accusatory, that he had been judged and found, not guilty, but merely unsatisfactory. The Imru Utmian had left the previous night, its next port of call wherever Popara's business took him. The new ambition, as Rayanne had christened it, was at berth X-13, and she and Eddie had already moved into it, running every diagnostic they could think of. Rayanne had insisted on taking a full day to sweep the ship, stem to stern, for any type of bug. She would have taken another day if Mander had not made clear that they needed to be on their way to Endragod. Mander dressed and slowly packed his few belongings into a shoulder satchel, a spare set of clothing, and the more formal robes he had worn to meet with Popara. He hefted his lightsaber. Once again, he thought about how little affinity he had for the weapon. He had built it himself, harvesting the crystal at its heart and meditating over it, imbuing it with the Force. Yet, he never felt he had the connection with the device, the extension of one's own self into it. It was not a serpent, yet it wasn't a part of himself either. It was a thing, a tool that could be used. Mander Zuma shook his head and attached the lightsaber to his belt. Rayanne and the Bothan would be waiting for him. He shoved the dream to the back of his mind, where it would wait for another night to haunt him. Hoisting his satchel, he went to join his crew on the new ambition.
The ship's clean,
said Rayanne, coming back from the cargo hold. They had lifted off from pad X-13 at the Makm-T spaceport and were now heading to the initial jump point pre-programmed into the navigation system. She threw herself into the co-pilot's chair in a frustrated tangle. Eddie was at the main controls, and Mander, his Magna Specs pinching his nose, was fussing with the jump calculations, trying to make sense of the program. He had spent much of the previous day at it, and realized that Rayanne was correct. Despite his knowledge of space navigation in theory, the complexities of implementing a real-world example were a challenge. Rayanne said it looked okay. He would have to trust that the calculations were correct. Rayanne continued.
I've checked the cargo, the holds, and everywhere I would think to put a secret compartment. There's nothing except what they claim to be there. The medicinal spice is standard issue, though I will admit that it is of a superior grade. Nothing illegal there. Went over the ship with a bug buster and no trackers or listening devices. Ditto the computers. Everything is just as it is supposed to be.
I'm glad you're happy,
said Mander. He removed the Magna Specs, folded them in on themselves, and placed them in his robe pocket over his heart.
I'm not,
replied the Pantoran, pushing an errant dark hair out of her eyes.
These are Hutts. There has to be something going on here that they are not telling us.
There is probably much they didn't tell us,
said Mander,
as well as all the things they did not tell us until the last moment.
Rand looked over at Mander.
And maybe there's more.
Maybe,
said Eddie.
No one has ever tried these coordinates before.
Mander blinked and looked at Rayanne. She shrugged and walked over to the Jedi's station, pointing at the unspooling code.
I'm not so sure. Most of this stuff looks like it was improvised. Pure seat of the pants flying, nothing you could normally get a droid or a navbot to do. Droids are too linear in their thoughts. This is much more like the recording of a spacer who got herself into trouble and was shocked and surprised to find that she lived through the experience. But I checked the figures 3 times. It should work.
And it would be a fairly elaborate effort just to test if the coordinates are correct. They have their own ships and pilots, and indeed, they gave us this one,
Mander said.
Let's assume that what we've been told is true, and that these coordinates will take us to Endragod.
Rayanne rubbed her arm where the vaccination needle had bit deep.
Speaking of trust, what do we know about this plague?
Mander motioned toward Vago's datapad.
The Endragod plague is so far confined primarily to Endragod thanks to the efforts of the Corporate Sector Authority. A smuggler's ship from the planet showed up in Rudrig in the Tion cluster about 3 weeks ago. Its crew was too weak to land, and the ship was boarded and impounded. The CSA quickly slapped a lid down on Endragod itself, and have one of their dreadnoughts in orbit.
No other cases off-planet?
Asked Rayanne.
Not according to this report, but the symptoms are similar to a couple of other known diseases that come from blasted, irradiated worlds.
Mander noted.
Symptoms include fever, dehydration, crusting around the mouth and ears, general weakness, and a thickening of the fingers and tongue. Repeated exposures can kill.
Rayanne rubbed her arm again.
I've never been to Endragod. Is it a blasted, irradiated world?
Mander noticed her action.
No, but it's no surprise you haven't visited it. It's hardly a tourist spot. Most of the planet is buttes, mesas, and dry washes. It is a pretty arid place, with the open bottomlands plagued by windstorms. One major city, Tel Bolin. Major product is the geode trade, crystals found within hollow rocks.
Which is why Mika Hutasei was there,
noted Rayanne. Mander nodded.
Again, from the report, it looks like it was purely routine business dealings. Then, a couple of days after he arrived, everything went blasters up.
And we have to find him,
Rayanne said.
A single Hutt on a big world.
He'll definitely stand out in a crowd,
said Mander.
What do you think of his family?
Can't say I like any of them,
said Rayanne.
Popara is fat, Zonos is slovenly, and Vago acts like she owns us. That's the Hutt trifecta right there.
Popara is honest,
said Eddie. Mander and Rayanne both looked at him.
I can tell,
said Eddie.
It's not a Bothan ability or anything, but I can tell. Even when his words were translated through a droid, he didn't lie to you.
But he may not have told the truth in all things,
said Rayanne. Eddie raised his hands, palms up.
You had asked if Popara's clan ran spice,
said Mander.
Did you get the response you expected?
No,
said Rayanne.
I expected a stronger condemnation of it if they were involved in trading hard spice. So it was a good answer, as far as they were concerned.
A good answer,
repeated Mander Zuma, then added,
While you were sweeping the ship, I did take the opportunity of checking on the Bomu clan. No one had seen any of them on Makm-T since the night of the attack. They are all hiding, dead or gone.
The Pantoran's smuggler and the Bothan exchanged a glance. Just a quick one. but enough to confirm to Mander that they had done some of their own checking when they were supposed to be readying the ship.
Gone but not forgotten,
said Rayan.
Each Rhodian clan spans at least a dozen planets. The survivors of our little set are likely on other worlds getting their aunts and uncles all indignant about us shooting up their place.
Mander nodded and returned to the business at hand.
Thoughts on Xanos?
Rayan's right,
said Eddie.
Typical Hutt.
You look up Hutt in a lexicon and you'll see Xanos' picture,
said Rayan.
It appears he spends his time drinking away his father's fortune with his Wookiee friends.
They didn't seem to like you much,
said Mander to Eddie. Another shrug from the Bothan.
I rub some people the wrong way. Some Wookiees are brave and dedicated. Some are bullies. The ones with Xanos are the latter.
And as you say, you can just tell,
said Mander. And once again Eddie raised his palms in his.
What can I do?
Attitude.
What did Xanos want with you?
Asked Rayan, confident now that they were out of earshot of listening devices.
Back on the ship, when that droid pulled you away.
Xanos Hutt wanted to assure me that he had no problem if we failed to find his brother, or failed to bring him back alive,
said Mander.
Sibling affection,
said Rayan.
Rivals for their father's attention.
Xanos fits the basic assumptions about Hutt's well,
Mander said, nodding.
He probably wouldn't do the deed himself, but he definitely won't be too heartbroken if something happened to Mika.
Do Hutts even have hearts?
Said Rayan.
Vago,
said Mander, ignoring her and bringing up the next topic.
Bureaucrat,
replied Rayan.
Petty functionary. Keeps the wheels going and is afraid to step out of line.
I don't think so,
said Mander.
What were you talking about in Hutt Teas back on the Outlander?
Asked Eddie, clearly curious.
She didn't seem too offended by your horrible accent, by the way.
Mander looked at Eddie. It was an honest question, one he would not have asked if he already had the answer.
No,
Mander decided.
He doesn't know the language. She told me that Popara wiped out her family in one of their clan wars, but adopted her instead of killing her. I don't think she's just a bureaucrat. She's devoted to him, probably much more than those Twi'lek handmaidens. Vago is not afraid. But Rayan is correct in one thing. She does keep the wheels spinning.
Rayan counted the Hutts off on her fingers.
You think Popara is truly concerned about his son? Xanos wouldn't mind being an only child.
And Vago wants things to run smoothly,
said Mander.
She wants Popara to be looking at the balance sheets as opposed to fretting about his boy.
So that means we go ahead,
concluded Rayan.
That means we go ahead,
said Mander.
Unless Xanos and his Wookiees had the brains to sabotage the coordinates, the flight plan that Popara gave us should work.
A small chime sounded in the cabin.
We're ready to go,
said Eddie.
We're clear of the gravitational well. Final coordinates locked in for the first jump.
Let's get started then,
said Mander. He wanted to add,
and if the Hutts were lying to us, I apologize for getting us all killed.
Eddie took a deep breath and threw the hyperdrive engage switch. The stars began to lengthen before them, and Mander found he was holding his breath. The coordinates provided showed 6 jumps to navigate through the Indrexu spiral. The first jump took them deep into the spiral itself, such that the arcs of stars and cometary dust wheeled along the starboard side of the ship. The second put them uncomfortably close to an asteroid cluster, a moon that had either failed to form or been smashed millennia ago and left for dead. They had to wait half an hour before proceeding to the next point, dodging debris. The third point was in orbit around a ruined comet, its last icy blasts echoing in all directions. The fourth was nothing. or rather something dark and malignant that blotted out a quarter of the starfield behind them. Mander was particularly glad to leave that behind. The penultimate link came out at the tipping point between two gargantuan suns, blue and orange. Flaming plumes from their dappled surfaces reached out and combined in an incandescent rainbow. Dark spots roiled along these liquid rivers like mountains, and for a moment Mander thought them immense, living things that migrated along the fiery bridges between the suns, driven by unknowable internal clocks. And then one last jump, and the streaks of hyperdrive molted light shrank back to the friendly familiar stars. Rayan punched in the local navigation coordinates.
I've got a fix on the local astronomical markers. We are where we are supposed to be. You were right. Nothing to worry about.
Mander said nothing, but allowed himself an embarrassed grin. Eddie started to run a post-jump analysis, but even Mander could see that all of the telltales were a comfortable green. Rayan said,
I have Endragud. Far side of its orbit, so it is unlikely that we've been spotted by the CSA. We take a high arc and come down over the poles, and depending on how many ships they have in system, see them before they see.
She was cut off by twin streaks of ionic energy laced out across the nose of the vessel. The cockpit transceiver let out a bell-like tone and sparked to life.
Attention, freighter,
said a voice in heavily accented basic.
You are privileged to be under the guns of the illustrious Bomu clan. Dump your cargo or be prepared to be boarded.
The message was punctuated by another blast of the cannons.
Light freighter off the port,
said Eddie.
Heavily modded. I see half a dozen hardpoints. Has us bracketed.
Gone but not forgotten,
said Mander.
Yeah,
said Rayan.
Get us out of here, Eddie.
The bosun's furred hands swept over the control toggles, rerouting power to the engines.
Hang on,
he said. The ship was almost immediately rocked to one side, and energy sparked in the cockpit.
Hit,
said Eddie, scanning the telltales, a line of them flashing red.
There go our port weapons.
Flip us,
said Rayan, already heading for the starboard turret. Mander Zuma barely had time to shout as the stars spun before him, bringing the still-functioning ion blaster turret to bear against their attacker. The deck did not shift, but the swirl of the stars in the viewport caused him to grip the arm of the chair. Even so, the sudden vertigo caused the Jedi to drop to one knee. Eddie didn't ask about Mander's condition. Instead, his long fingers were dancing over the controls. The ship leapt forward as Rayan fired off a salvo. The beams of ionic energy danced over the hull of the attacking ship, but did not leave so much as a scorch.
Underpowered piece of standard equipment,
muttered the bosun, and then shouted aloud for Rayan to hear him.
Going to keep the spin, but shift our deflectors to aft. You'll have to shoot on the fly.
Rayan made a strangled noise that Mander assumed was agreement, and the ship shuddered again as the Bomu's freighter struck them from behind. Mander felt helpless. The bosun was better at the controls, and the Pantoran could handle the guns. He was dead weight at the moment, without a life-or-death task at hand. Instead, his fate was in the hands of the others, and there was nothing he could do.
No,
Mander thought.
I have the luxury of being able to think.
He settled himself back into the jump seat, folded his hands over his chest, and closed his eyes against the spinning stars. The The ship shuddered again, and the Bothan cursed.
I would appreciate any good suggestions now, Jedi,
he snapped.
I say we void the cargo hold and hope they stop to pick up the supplies.
His fingers reached up to touch a toggle overhead.
No,
said Mander, reaching out and grabbing Eddie's wrist.
Head in that direction.
He indicated a nondescript piece of space 2 points off the bow. The Bothan looked panic-stricken now.
What's over there?
Help,
said the Jedi.
But we won't reach it unless we get fancy.
The Bothan muttered something about his opinions of getting fancy, but he brought the ship around, the yellow sphere of Endragod's sun shifting into view. Behind them, Rayen shouted out a surprised retort, and a blast of ionic fire raked along the side of the ship. Sparks flew, and the Bothan said,
I hope you know what you're doing. We should dump the spice.
If they're really the Bomu, they won't stop for the spice,
said Mander.
That's just an excuse. I'm going to count to 10. On 10, you kill the engines and throw in the landing retros. Bring us to a stop.
A full stop? Are you mad?
Eddie's face was twisted in fear.
Completely mad,
said the Jedi.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hang on,
snarled the Bothan.
I don't want to flood the ion chambers.
5, 6, 7.
Hold on to something, Rayen,
shouted Eddie.
We're getting fancy. Be ready to fire.
8, 9, 10.
Mander thumped the Bothan on the shoulder, and Eddie mashed one hand against a series of buttons, fingers spread like a jizz performer playing on an alargan. The other hand pulled back fully on the retro jet lever, which fought the pilot for every millimeter. The ship shuddered as the stern engines sought to keep plunging forward. Behind him, Mander could hear the hull strain and hoped that the engine brackets would hold. And suddenly, they were stopped, still spinning, as the Bomu freighter sailed over them. Mander had timed the order perfectly, so that Rayen's guns were locked on as they shot past. She strafed the lower hull, leaving long furrows along the ship's belly, from which billowed gases, frozen in an instant into a crystalline mist. Mander nodded. Their attacker had put all deflectors up front in anticipation of the chase. Mander was going to tell Eddie to do the same thing, but the Bothan was already reconfiguring the shields, swinging them as the enemy ship came around for a head-on assault. Rayen fired a few more rounds, but the Rhodians had recovered and had their shields up as well. Double ionic beams lanced forward, and the ship shuddered again.
I hope you have another plan,
said Eddie.
Because we're dead in space, and the deflectors won't take another hit like that.
Wait for it,
said Mander.
Wait for what?
The Bothan started to say, but his answer crested over the stern of the Bomu freighter. There were two of them, CSA starfighters. They were Intercept Reconnaissance Defense Craft, IRDs for short, and consisted of full-vision cockpit, a pilot's seat, and an engine, and two forward-mounted blaster cannons supported by concussion missiles, all of which they brought to bear against the now unshielded stern of the Bomu raider. The explosions began in the rear of the ship, cascading forward as the raider was unable to respond in time. There was a fireball, and the new ambition flinched as the shock wave passed. Parts of their assailant drifted past their ship like small asteroids, some of them still on fire.
You knew they were there,
said the Bothan, looking at the scattered debris.
I could feel a ripple in the Force,
said Mander.
But I knew they'd be too late if we simply sent a distress signal. Better to meet them halfway, attract their attention with a display of firepower, and let them come to the rescue.
Rayanne appeared at the hatch of the cockpit. Blood oozed at the corner of her mouth, and she had a nasty darkening around one eye.
What do you call that maneuver?
Getting fancy,
said Eddie, shaking his head at the amber and crimson lights that now covered one side of his display. The comlink burbled again.
Attention, unidentified freighter,
said the voice, clipped, precise, and no nonsense.
You have entered a quarantine system by orders of the Corporate Sector Authority. No landings are permitted on Endragod. Repeat, no landings are permitted. Either jump out of the system or we will escort you to the Resolute. Please respond.
We could turn tail and try to jump to hyperspace,
said the bosun.
But after what we put this ship through, I don't know about our chances.
Mander flicked open the comlink.
New ambition to the Resolute fighters. We have been damaged and appreciate the offer of aid. We will follow you.
He closed the transceiver and said,
There is a time to sneak about and a time to talk. This is a time to talk.
For all our sakes,
muttered Rayanne.
I hope you're right.